Summer 1943. The sun was high, beating down on the long, dusty road that led to the American camp in Louisiana. Inside the transport truck, the air smelled of damp wool and fear, a mixture as familiar to Liesel Vogel as the stench of Dresden's rubble after a raid. Around her, the other women shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide and suspicious. Greta Hoffmann clutched a thin bundle of blankets, as if holding on to the last shred of her old life. Anneliese Kruger, older and braver than most, squinted at the sprawling compound ahead, muttering curses under her breath, half anger, half disbelief. The truck screeched to a halt. The women were herded out, boots crunching on gravel. What met them was not the gray, barbed wire nightmare they had imagined. Instead, sunlight glinted off the freshly painted wooden barracks. A row of sinks lined the wall of a small pavilion, water glistening in the morning light as if it had been blessed by some minor miracle. And there, at the far end, a line of showers hissed and steamed, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls. Liesel froze. Her hand trembled as she reached for a bar of soap, its smoothness shocking against the rough skin of her fingers. "It's clean," she whispered, almost afraid the word might dissolve in the warm Louisiana air. Around her, Anneliese rolled her eyes, but even she could not hide the slight twitch of a smile. Greta's jaw dropped, her thin frame seemed to shrink in awe and uncertainty. Sergeant Robert "Bob" Mason stood nearby, his posture casual but attentive. He was no cruel disciplinarian. There was something in his steady gaze that suggested he had seen enough of war to recognize humanity where others saw only enemies. Lieutenant Helen Carter, clipboard in hand, oversaw the scene with professional calm, ensuring the women were guided gently, firmly, without humiliation. "This isn't a test," Mason said softly to no one in particular, and perhaps it was the first time anyone had heard a voice not laced with command or threat. The women exchanged nervous glances, their skepticism colliding with wonder. In Germany, Liesel had imagined a camp as unrelenting as a furnace, where freedom was measured in scraps of bread and fleeting shadows. Here, the rules were different. Even the air smelled differently. Less fear, more possibility. The first showers were a study in hesitant ritual. Greta dipped a finger into the steaming water and flinched as warmth spread, unfamiliar and almost indecent. Liesel guided her hand, showing her how to lather the soap. Tiny bubbles clung to skin like jewels, and for a moment, the women laughed. Soft, tentative laughter that felt foreign, like sunlight on winter snow. Anneliese, ever bold, stepped fully under the spray, letting the water rush over her. She squealed as she slipped slightly on the wet floor, earning a burst of laughter from the other two. Mason's eyes twinkled. He shook his head at the scene, amused, and yet there was pride in his expression. These small gestures of liberation, mundane to an American guard, were monumental to women who had lived through firebombs and hunger. In that moment, soap became more than hygiene, it was a symbol. A bar of white, fragrant reassurance that their bodies still belonged to themselves. A tiny rebellion against the years of fear and deprivation. Liesel held hers tightly, almost as a talisman. "We survived this far," she thought. "Perhaps we can survive everything else." And yet, as they emerged from the showers, wrapped in the camp-issued towels, a sliver of doubt lingered. Were they safe here? Were the smiles genuine, or was this some trick of their captor's kindness? The doubt did not erase the momentary joy, nor did it diminish the thrill of water flowing over skin unaccustomed to warmth. But nothing prepared them for what came next. The first night at the camp brought a strange kind of unease. The barracks, tidy and well-ventilated, smelled faintly of pine and freshly laundered linens. Liesel Vogel lay on her cot, listening to the low murmur of the other women settling in, their whispered German voices bouncing off polished wooden walls. It was too quiet, too clean. She had imagined barbed wire and shouted orders, not this gentle hum of domestic order. Greta Hoffmann, curled under her thin blanket, whispered across the room, "Do you think they will feed us enough?" Her words were tinged with the hunger of months spent rationing scraps, yet there was a note of disbelief in her tone. The food, when it came, was unrecognizable in its abundance. Soft bread, steaming vegetables, even a small square of chocolate for each. The women stared at their plates as if the world had tilted on its axis. Anneliese Kruger, ever sharp, poked her cabbage with a fork. "In Germany, we would have fought for half this meal," she muttered, a grin tugging at her lips. By morning, the ritual of washing had become a small theater of culture clash. The women lined up for showers, moving cautiously as if stepping onto holy ground. Warm water poured over their skin, and steam curled in lazy spirals around their faces. Greta fumbled with the bar of soap, trying to remember the precise rhythm her mother had taught her. Anneliese laughed outright, slipping slightly on the wet floor again, and even Liesel found herself grinning at the scene. Outside, the guards observed silently. Sergeant Robert Mason noted the careful hesitations, the tiny bursts of laughter, the wonder etched into young faces. He had spent years training for battle, yet here, in a camp thousands of miles from home, he realized that winning hearts could be more challenging and more meaningful than winning battles. Lieutenant Helen Carter, clipboard tucked under her arm, moved among the women, offering gentle instructions on hygiene and camp rules, blending authority with compassion. Even the smallest routines became lessons in adaptation. Laundry days revealed that folding a crisp shirt was a science, not a chore. The women's fingers fumbled over buttons and fabric, and Anneliese's sigh of frustration echoed in the barracks. "In Hamburg, we survived cold and hunger. And yet, a shirt can defeat me," she muttered. Liesel laughed quietly, recognizing the absurdity, while Greta's tentative smile spoke of small victories. The contrast between expectation and reality extended to leisure hours. The women were allowed walks in the sun, supervised by guards who never tried to impose unnecessary control. Birds flitted across the fields, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed paused, the war reduced to distant smoke on the horizon. Yet shadows lingered. The camp was still a prison, their freedom curtailed, their futures uncertain. Irony threaded through every new experience. The women, trained to see the Americans as cruel and unyielding, discovered patience and courtesy instead. A bar of soap became a weapon of transformation, water a liberator, and laughter a shield against despair. Small details carried symbolism. The first shower, a cleansing of fear; the first full meal, nourishment not just of the body but of hope; the first polite conversation with a guard, proof that humanity persisted even in war. As the days passed, tension simmered beneath the surface. Liesel noticed Greta's fingers trembling slightly when handling utensils, a residue of the years of scarcity. Anneliese, never shy, pressed questions about why they were treated with such kindness, why punishment was rare, and why soap and water were offered freely rather than hoarded. Mason, overhearing, could only shrug with a half-smile. "Sometimes, it's simpler to care," he said, a phrase that seemed to puzzle and unsettle the women in equal measure. Even humor emerged as a coping mechanism. One afternoon, the three women tried to eat corn on the cob without utensils, laughter spilling as kernels scattered across the table. "In Berlin, this would have been a battlefield," Anneliese quipped. Liesel and Greta joined in, giggling despite themselves. The absurdity of learning to navigate abundance was as disorienting as it was liberating. By the end of the week, a transformation was quietly underway. The women were no longer merely surviving, they were adjusting, observing, learning. The camp's routines, initially alien, became a framework for tentative trust. And yet, a spark of skepticism remained. Could such kindness be genuine, or was it another layer of a war built on manipulation? But what came next would test every assumption they had made. The camp settled into a rhythm, a pulse of routines and rituals that felt strangely domestic in the midst of war. Morning showers gave way to breakfast, breakfast to chores, and chores to the rare, trembling taste of leisure. Liesel Vogel had discovered a small pleasure in scrubbing the wooden floors until they gleamed, feeling a sense of control over her surroundings that had been absent for months. Greta Hoffmann, still timid, watched her, mimicking movements with careful concentration, while Anneliese Kruger prowled the barracks, teasing and encouraging in equal measure. The women began to share stories. Liesel spoke of Dresden, of nights when the sky burned with fire and the wind carried the screams of neighbors. Greta's memories were quieter, of her mother scolding her for petty mistakes, a childhood framed by discipline and scarcity. Anneliese's voice rose and fell with the tides of her losses, of brothers and fathers ripped from her world by war. These confessions, whispered over steaming cups of weak coffee, became bridges across the gulf of fear and suspicion. The American guards and officers watched, sometimes silently, sometimes offering gentle guidance. Sergeant Robert Mason's eyes lingered on the women not with suspicion but with a cautious respect. He noted the subtle shifts in posture, the tentative smiles that lingered longer each day. Lieutenant Helen Carter encouraged small competitions in chores and cooking, framing them as games to cultivate both skill and morale. The POWs, skeptical at first, slowly began to participate, finding joy in the mastery of simple tasks. Yet resistance simmered beneath the surface. Old habits die hard. Liesl recoiled at certain gestures of intimacy, brushing off a touch of a hand or a casual laugh with a guard. Greta's smiles were careful, tentative, as if testing boundaries that she could not fully trust. Annalise challenged rules when she deemed them silly, rolling her eyes at arbitrary instructions and insisting on her own order in small things, a crooked picture, a misaligned bed. Each act of subtle defiance was a reminder that freedom could not be given entirely, only navigated. Even the most mundane tasks became symbolic lessons. Laundry taught patience. Cooking lessons revealed the artistry of abundance. Walks in the sunshine became exercises in trust and observation. Humor threaded through these lessons like a lifeline. One afternoon, the three women attempted to milk a goat for the first time under the watchful eye of Mason, who could barely contain his laughter at their clumsy fumbling. Cornmeal spilled, hooves kicked, and laughter erupted, echoing off the barracks like a tiny rebellion against fear itself. Symbols abounded. Soap was no longer just soap, it was a tangible token of dignity regained. Water was no longer merely wet, it was a baptism of self-possession. Liesl caught herself studying the bubbles that danced on the surface of the wash basin, imagining them as tiny shields against the chaos of the world outside. Greta tucked a piece of chocolate into her pocket one morning, savoring it slowly, as if hoarding sweetness could also preserve hope. Annalise drew maps of the camp in the dust on the floorboards, tracing borders and paths, reclaiming a sense of space in a world that had denied them agency. The cultural contrasts continued to surprise. Rules the women had considered absurd, lining up for meals, folding blankets to precise angles, became sources of fascination. In Germany, they had fought hunger and cold. Here, they were learning patience and skill. The absurdity was never lost. The first time Annalise tried to slice an apple perfectly with a dull knife, only to have it tumble to the floor, all three women laughed until their sides ached. The guard smiled too, seeing in their laughter the slow thawing of old fears. By the week's end, bonds had formed. Liesl, Greta, and Annalise were no longer strangers forced together by circumstance. They were collaborators in survival, allies in navigating a strange and benevolent captivity. The POWs were learning that resistance could coexist with acceptance, that small acts of autonomy could flourish even under guard and order. Yet the lingering question remained: was this kindness genuine? Could the Americans truly treat them as humans rather than enemies? The answer would soon come in ways more profound than showers, meals, or laughter. For even in a camp of civility, the war outside still loomed, and the next test of courage would be unlike any before. The morning sun glinted across the camp with a brilliance that seemed almost deliberate, as if the world itself conspired to mark a turning point. Liesl Vogel stretched her arms, savoring the warm air, the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the earthy aroma of the fields. Today was different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation, a tremor in the rhythm of routine, though none could have predicted the depth of what awaited them. The three women moved together toward the work pavilion, their steps lighter than before. Greta's eyes sparkled with a curiosity that had seemed dormant for months, and Annalise, ever bold, carried herself with the ease of someone reclaiming small fragments of life stolen by war. Soap and water had been their first taste of liberation. Today, their liberation extended to spirit and will. Sergeant Robert Mason and Lieutenant Helen Carter watched from a distance. Mason, normally reserved, felt a swell of pride he did not bother to hide. Carter's eyes softened as she observed the subtle transformations, the straightening of posture, the flashes of laughter, the courage in the smallest gestures. These women, once huddled and fearful, were beginning to shine. The day's task was deceptively simple: cleaning the barracks in preparation for inspection. Yet it became a theater of transformation. Liesl scrubbed the floorboards, her movements deliberate, almost meditative, as though each stroke erased the residue of fear and helplessness. Greta wiped the windows, letting sunlight stream through newly polished panes, and Anneliese organized supplies, humming a tune she had invented on the journey from Germany. Their laughter, tentative at first, grew bold, unafraid. A sudden interruption. A crate of apples had been delivered for the women's midday meal. The apples, round and glossy, rolled unpredictably across the floorboards. Liesel bent to gather them, noticing the bubbles of water clinging to the polished floor, reflecting the sunlight like tiny prisms. She laughed, a pure, unguarded sound, and the others joined in. Even Mason, who had seen the worst of human cruelty, could not suppress a chuckle. The absurdity of rolling fruit, the delight in something so ordinary, became emblematic of a larger truth. Joy could exist even amid the machinery of war. Later, as the women washed their hands in the communal basin, Anneliese held a bar of soap, watching the suds swirl and rise. "Look at this," she said softly, almost reverently, "how it lifts and floats, no matter what it touches. We can be like this too." Liesel and Greta followed her gaze, and for a moment, the simple act of washing became a ritual of symbolic freedom. Each bubble was a shield against fear, each drop of water a reminder that they were alive, still human, still capable of agency. The afternoon brought an announcement that jolted everyone. A small contingent of POWs would be transferred to another camp with fewer restrictions. Liesel felt a pang of fear. Change had always been dangerous, but this time it was tempered with trust. They had learned to navigate kindness, to recognize genuine care. When the opportunity arrived to help younger women prepare for the transfer, Liesel took charge, guiding them with confidence. Greta's hands no longer trembled as she packed her few belongings, and Anneliese offered humor to ease tension, making light of spilled soap and crooked blankets. By the day's end, a subtle revolution had occurred. The POWs were no longer passive recipients of American benevolence. They were active participants in their own restoration. Soap, food, laughter, and work had become instruments of reclamation, and each woman carried within her a spark of autonomy that no war could extinguish. The climax arrived not in drama but in a quiet, almost sacred act. Liesel, Greta, and Anneliese gathered in the sunlit yard, the day fading to gold, and shared stories of what they had lost and what they were beginning to regain. Anneliese held her soap aloft, watching the bubbles rise and drift, catching sunlight before popping silently. "We came here afraid," she said, "but we leave knowing we can endure, and perhaps even thrive." The bubbles burst one by one, fragile yet fleetingly beautiful, a metaphor for resilience and the impermanence of suffering. Sergeant Mason and Lieutenant Carter observed, their expressions reflective. The women's transformation was a testament not just to survival, but to the quiet power of dignity restored. In a world scorched by conflict, small gestures, the warmth of water, the lift of laughter, the simplicity of clean hands, had become acts of defiance, rebellion against despair. As dusk fell, the camp was alive with an unusual serenity. Liesel, wrapping herself in a towel, whispered to Greta, "We came with nothing but fear. We leave with dignity." The words hung in the air, a quiet victory echoing against wooden walls and sun-warmed earth. The war still raged beyond the fences, but inside the camp, the women had reclaimed a piece of themselves. Their laughter, their stories, their courage, and their soap-scented triumphs became a quiet legend, a testament to resilience, hope, and the liberation of the human spirit. And in the rising moonlight, bubbles still glimmered faintly in the air, a delicate, defiant signal that even in darkness, beauty and freedom could take shape.